Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E. Efrain. Today, we are going to be talking about diabetes mellitus, specifically a topic that is relatively new, that is the topic of glucotypes. We are going to talk with a real authority at the world stage of science. We have with us Dr. Michael Snyder. He's a professor of genetics at Stanford, director of the Center of Genomics and Personalized Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Snyder.
Great, it's great to be here.
Thank you. So we will talk about a paper that was published in PLOS Biology. The title of the paper is Glucotypes Reveal New Patterns of Glucose Dysregulation. So diabetes mellitus and the metabolic syndrome are achieving epidemic proportions, and we think that probably the time to change some paradigms and the way we approach the disease are definitely something that we need to explore. So it's been traditional that the diagnosis and follow-up of diabetes mellitus is based on just static tests. So that means fasting glucose, some glucose tolerance tests. But there is a new proposal of characterizing diabetes in a different way. So I'm going to start by asking Dr. Snyder, why do you think the traditional way of approaching diagnosis of diabetes is still lacking something?
Well, it doesn't really, it's a good point. It doesn't really get at what's going on, meaning we just see people with their final glucose levels. The other marker you may know is something called hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of sort of steady state glucose levels. And what's special about these new technologies, so the new technology is something called continuous glucose monitors. It's a small patch you put right on your arm or sometimes on your stomach. And basically it follows your glucose, measures it every 5 minutes. And the reason that's powerful is that means if you eat something, you can see exactly what it's doing to your glucose levels, meaning if you eat a big sugary drink, there's a good chance your glucose levels will go totally out of control, especially if you have severe glucose dysregulation. So these new monitors are powerful because they can follow exactly what's going on. The other reason they're powerful is that we all respond differently to foods. That is to say, some people will wind up spiking to potatoes, others to pasta, some to bread, some to grapes. We're all different, and it's very personalized. And so what's going on is that we think, so as you point out, diabetes is hitting endemic proportions. 9% of the US are diabetic, 33% are pre-diabetic, and 90% of them don't know it. And 70% of those pre-diabetics will become diabetic. So these numbers are getting higher. So diabetes and glucose dysregulation is running out of control. And these new technologies, basically, they give a new way of following what's going on with glucose dysregulation. And because it's so personal, the way people seem to be dysregulated, you can actually see what's going on and do something about it.
Yeah, and I think definitely the new approaches are welcome, and I see in your paper that you mentioned the blood sugar variability becomes an important point. So that variability is problematic in what sense?
Yeah, so it's a problem because, again, everybody's dysregulated differently. Maybe backing up slightly, these glucose monitors had been being used for something called type 1 and type 2 insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. People who are dependent on insulin really have to know their glucose and get it well controlled, or it causes a lot of organ damage and other problems. So what's special is that we took these monitors and put them on basically people who are normal and pre-diabetic. And what we discovered, first of all, is that a lot of people have glucose dysregulation who have no idea, meaning some people, in fact, who are so-called normal are spiking just as bad as diabetics, meaning their glucose levels going up. So, and they were probably missed because of the mechanism, the way they're type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes isn't just one thing. It's probably many different things, the underlying mechanisms that cause it. And so, first of all, we discovered that a lot of people have glucose dysregulated way, way more than people realize. Then the other issue is that what you're alluding to is that people do respond to food differently, that we're highly variable in most of all how we're dysregulated and the types of food that causes dysregulation. And the reason these monitors then are a big deal, if you ever wear one of these, and I encourage anyone listening to do so, you will be amazed at what foods spike you and which ones don't. It's very eye-opening. I guarantee everyone who's worn one of these monitors will learn something new. My case, a very simple case, was pulled pork. I ate a pulled pork sandwich. Suddenly, my glucose went up over 350, which is very, very high. A normal number would be something like 120. Okay, so my glucose went way out of control. And when I showed this to someone, everybody said, well, everybody knows pulled pork has sugar in it. Well, I didn't know that. And that turns out to be very true. You'd be surprised how many things have sugar in it and how much sugar that you have no idea of. And then the other thing is, I say, even sugar aside, we all spike to different things. So one things we discovered in that paper is that some people spike to bread and peanut butter. Other people spike to protein bars, which turn out to have carbohydrates in them. They don't advertise that. Some do, some don't. And you can see exactly what's spiking you. We discovered 80% of people spike to cornflakes and milk. That stuff is super evil. We think it's what's called very high glycemic. It really has a lot of essentially things that will lead to sugar in your blood. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah, and like everything in medicine, in order to make the right decisions, we need data points. And with these glucose control monitors, you sample blood sugar on a periodic basis. So how often does it get sampled?
It gets sampled every 5 minutes. So the devices themselves, you put on your arm or your stomach, as they say, and they last for about 5 weeks. And they'll be sampling every 5 minutes, and they'll run their glucose curves right into your smartphone. So you can see exactly what your glucose levels are in real time. And then, as I say, it's very eye-opening what foods do it. The other thing you can do with this, it turns out, is that you can actually do behaviors that will mitigate those spikes. Meaning, and I'm totally conflicted, but I have a company we've spun off part of this called January AI. And what they do is they have a teaching program built around this, meaning you'll wear this thing, they'll tell you eat your favorite food. And for most people, their favorite food is something sugary. So they'll eat their favorite food and it'll spike them. And then they'll say the next day, eat your favorite food and do a 15-minute walk. And you'll see your spike gets very suppressed, meaning it doesn't go very high. So we're teaching people, and so now as a consequence of this, I try and take a walk almost every time after I eat a big meal, especially a high carbohydrate meal or something sugary. I like to take a walk, and you'd be amazed at how much that keeps your glucose levels down.
Just by walking, yeah, that's interesting because you achieve a dual effect. First, is going to be probably a screening tool, and we are going to talk about it. But it also has the ability to change behavior. So if you have that on your cell phone, probably you can actually do something about it, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extremely eye-opening. You'd be amazed. I guarantee everyone who wears a glucose monitor will be blown away by what's going on, especially as you get older, because that's when your glucose dysregulation goes off, as you may know.
Yeah, and out of curiosity, how do you get a hold of one of these? You need a prescription for this, or is it over the counter? How does it work?
Yeah, in Europe, they're over the counter. In the US, you do need a prescription. So you can talk to your physician, or there's now several companies. I mentioned mine, January AI, where you can go to their website. You sign up for this, and they will have a physician who then prescribes it for you. So they're very easy to get now, because they're becoming so widespread.
Yeah, it's exciting to see how this is revolutionizing the approach to diabetes. And let's go a little bit deeper into the study. The methodology in itself is complicated, and I am sure that for someone without that depth of knowledge like me, your explanations are going to be eye-opening. So. You included 57 participants in the study. What happened with them, and how did you conduct the analysis?
Yeah, so again, we were fairly interested. We knew diabetics were going to have a lot of glucose dysregulation and show spikes after eating. And so what we decided to do is just see, well, how often does this happen in normal people? People are so-called normal or pre-diabetics who are thought to have better control. So we put these devices on them for the full 2 weeks. And what we discovered, as I mentioned before, is that many people have glucose dysregulation. Some do have good glucose control. Some are what we call moderate spikers, and some are severe spikers. So we wrote algorithms to actually quantify what was going on. You know, are you pretty good glucose control and not spiking much? Are you moderate or are you severe? We call these glucotypes. So it's kind of a glucose, if you will, levels and spiking, what we call the phenotype, but so it's characteristics. So the bottom line is we can roughly classify, oh, you're pretty good on your glucose control, you're a moderate glucotype, or you're severe. Severe means you have a lot of dysregulation. You are not controlling your glucose well. And so after eating, and so that was step one. We could classify people, we could quantify them, and then we could see what foods would actually affect them. So and that's when we started testing people to different foods. And it was surprising to us at the time, this was not known. It's not as simple as just simple sugar spikes everyone to different degrees. It's a lot more complicated than that. So some people will spike to bananas, some people to bread, some to pasta, some to potatoes. And even their curves can differ a bit. It's pretty clear that something called your microbiome. So you may know you have more cells in your gut than you do in the human body. They're actually bacteria that break down your food. And we all have different microbiomes. And I think that's a key part of it. It's not the whole explanation, but it's part of it. And so your microbiome will break down different foods. And since we have different microbiomes, we're digesting food at different rates and differently. And we think that's part of the reason why you're spiking differently. So it may be you have a good microbiome for, say, breaking down potatoes, and maybe you break them down slowly, so you release sugar slowly into your blood and you don't spike as much. Maybe someone else breaks it down fast and leads very efficiently and leads to a very, very big spike. So we think that might be some of the explanation for what's going on. Although it's not completely worked out. Ultimately, we want to predict this. We want to be able to take a little blood drop and maybe your microbiome sample from you and actually predict, oh, you're the kind of person who, you're going to spike to bananas, but you won't spike to pasta. So maybe you should eat more pasta. So, but right now it's all empirical. That is to say, we use the devices themselves to see who spikes who. And and the company I'm affiliated with, they actually have a 32 million food database where they have the glycemic, it's called the glycemic load glycemic index, essentially how much sugar is stored in these foods that if you eat them, it'll wind up spiking you or not. And they have ways of making predictions. And this is the future, we believe, that we would train you basically. You for the company, you eat 4 days of food and do food logging, and we will know exactly what foods spike you. And then we say which ones don't, and then we'll say, well, you should eat these and not eat those. And we can do this, make these predictions even on foods you have not yet eaten, if that makes sense. Or by knowing food compositions, by knowing glycemic load, glycemic index, we can fairly precisely predict which foods you should be eating, which ones you should not, just from 4 days of training. And so we think that's going to be very, very powerful. And as you pointed out at the outset, this is a whole new way of trying to control glucose levels. And I hope will push off, at least to some extent, this diabetes endemic, because we really need to do something about it. It's very costly, both for people's health and economically. It's estimated to be something like almost $300 billion a year in the US is spent on diabetes-related complications. So we really need to get this under control, and we can have people living, longer, healthier lives. That's the goal.
Yeah, and I feel that by being able to control that, like the blood sugar as a result of an individualized approach, that is going to have several other ramifications, because metabolically there are many pathways affected at the same time. So I think everything is going to be translated into better health, as you say. So when you are exposed to these meals that you guys gave the patients or the participants, I assume that sometimes you had high variability, sometimes not so much. So how did you average that to classify each individual into one category?
Yeah. Well, as a general, people are fairly reproducible in their patterns, meaning if you spike the pasta, you do this several times, you'll get pretty much the same result each time, which is nice to know. It's not quite as variable for a person. But on the other hand, your spiking the pasta may look different from my spiking the pasta. So what we do is we basically calculate what the shape of that curve, these days we'll calculate the shape of that curve. We'll better understand, actually we can even predict a little bit of what could be wrong with you, meaning there's different kinds of diabetes. Some people are actually having trouble basically making insulin. Other people have trouble releasing it from the pancreas. Insulin's needed for actually controlling your glucose levels. Most people have trouble, their cells are what's called insulin resistant. They don't respond to insulin very well, and therefore they don't take up glucose. Their cells will fail to take up glucose. So we can actually, we think the curve and the types of food are actually will show up in that glucose signature, believe it or not. So we can get at some level of information about what's wrong with you in terms of glucose control from the curve itself. But empirically, again, a lot of the differences in spiking really comes down to the food itself. Your ability to metabolize, pasta will be different from mine, and same with potatoes, and same with all these different things. It's kind of interesting because if you think about it, it's one of the things we do the most, eating, yet we don't really understand how it works. And so we think this is, and the fact that it's so different. I mean, you may also know that 10% of people have inflammatory bowel syndrome. And that's probably to a large extent the food we eat, they eat, and they don't even know what foods cause us. So they don't know what foods are causing their inflammation or not. It's not as simple as, say, gluten, which is often the case for celiac disease. It's more complicated than that. And so just simple things we don't really know. I view this glucose control as sort of a first step, if you will, to trying to dissect at least the glucose dysregulation that's pretty rampant in our society.
And this glucose dysregulation, like defined in terms of the glucotypes, do you find a correlation between those glucotypes and other metabolic parameters like a BMI? I don't know. Is there a direct and good correlation?
There's some correlation, yeah. So there's definitely, the higher your glucotype, the more likely you'll be to type 2 diabetes and have high fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C. And as well, you might have higher BMI. Interestingly, BMI is fairly variable, meaning, yes, there's some correlation. People are overweight, tend to be diabetic. But you'd be amazed to know that there are some people who are incredibly obese who have good metabolic control. They're still metabolically normal, even though they're vastly overweight. So there's something special about those. And likewise, there are thin people who are actually, they look perfectly normal. It turns out they're type 2 diabetic. And I'm a case of that one, actually. You may not realize that I'm type 2 diabetic, and I'm pretty thin. So that was a big surprise. I became diabetic. It turns out I'm genetically predisposed to diabetes. And then I also became I became diabetic after a very nasty respiratory syncytial virus infection, believe it or not. So in my case, it's thought I was genetically predisposed, and then this environmental trigger, this virus infection, is what caused the disease. This has actually turned out to be rampant now in COVID. You may or may not know, 2 to 4% of people who get COVID actually wind up as diabetic. It's not always clear if they're type 1 or type 2, but they wind up in one form or another. So we think viral infections can at some level trigger this sort of thing. In our case, we think it has to do with something called epigenetics. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because we tend to think in black or white, right? We tend to think that diabetes is a synonym of obesity and the other way around, but not necessarily. And actually, the glucotypes that you show, there is a spectrum, right? And you can move across that spectrum depending on probably the decisions that you make also, right? In terms of your food consumption.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah, people who are high carb eaters, especially sugary drinks, you're definitely not doing yourself a favor.
Yeah, that's true. So in terms of diabetes diagnosis, like talking about the disease itself, what role do you think the glucotypes are going to play in diagnosis in the future?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that they're going to, and especially in follow-up work from that original paper, I'm pretty confident we'll be able to subtype the type of diabetes you are from the shape of the curve and the magnitude. So I think what it's going to do is tell us what your defect is. Like, are you insulin resistant? Are you not making insulin? There's something called incretin. This is a very hot hormone these days. GLP-1 is the name of this hormone, if you will. There are drugs out there now called Ozempic and others that people are taking to actually control their diabetes. Turns out they also cause weight loss. So they've been very, very powerful weight loss drugs as well. And so some people are actually defective in that. So different people are defective in different ways. And we can get some of that from these glucose curves. We think this is very, very powerful. And then I think what this is going to mean is that the food you eat can be very, very impactful in how you manage that glucose dysregulation. So you should be able to eat foods that stimulate incretin, for example, this hormone that actually, and what the hormone does is it promotes insulin release. So we should be able to eat foods and do lifestyle behaviors that will better manage, what's going on for our glucose levels. So I think it's still the early days. There's still tons to do here, but I think that's going to be a big factor. But minimally just knowing, and I think also we'll be able to eat different fibers, we'll be able to feed our microbiome differently to be able to manage. I mentioned the microbiome is very, very important for your glucose control. It's not the whole story, but it's part of the story. I think you're going to be able to better manage your microbiome so that you actually will be able to get better glucose control. That's the goal. We may find out, oh, you're very short on this, and therefore when you eat that food, that spikes your glucose. Well, one way is to avoid that food. Another way is to get the right bacteria in that would help you manage that better, eat the right fibers. That will help. We think that a big part of glucose control is the fiber you have in your gut. You may or may not know that Americans don't eat enough fiber. It's estimated women should have 25 grams a day, men 35. It turns out that the amount they actually eat is more like about 12 grams. So we're getting less than half the fiber we should. And by the way, the numbers I said were kind of a minimum. You should really be eating even more. So we think that people aren't having enough fiber. We think that is affecting their glucose control and affecting the glucotypes. So I think as we better understand this whole relationship, it's still early days, we don't yet, but we should be able to design, give them the right, they're called probiotics. They're the microbes that will feed your gut. And together with the right prebiotics, that's the fiber, that's the food that feeds the microbes, we can set up a better relationship in your gut, which will better control your glucose. And it's also going to do even more than that, because it's also going to control your immune system to some extent, meaning you may or may not know you have more immune cells in your gut than anywhere else in your body. And the reason for that is it's thought to be interfacing with the microbiome. and taking care of that. Most microbes in your gut are good for you. They're breaking down your food, making vitamins, and you've got a very nice relationship set up with your immune system, keeping everything in check. If the microbiome goes out of whack, your immune system goes out of whack, your metabolism goes out of whack, including your glucose. So we really need to get the balance of all these things just right. Your microbiome, therefore, and your food, which feeds the microbiome, and that'll very much impact your health and your metabolome.
Yeah, I see that it's a multifaceted approach. It's not just some things versus other things. It has to take into account the whole microbiome, the biology, immunology, and inflammation in the end, right?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, and with all the information that you gather with the continuous monitoring of glucose, as well as the analysis that you run, is there a way to understand better where is the problem in a particular patient, in the secretion and production of insulin versus resistance to insulin? Are you able to gain some insights out of that information?
We are now. We weren't at the time we did that study. Now we have a better idea because we've characterized people better. There's some simple tests you can do to see if people, well, they're not so simple. They were insulin resistant and some of these other things. With the now using AI machine learning, believe it or not, from the shape of the curve, we can predict where your problem is, whether you're insulin resistant, whether you have what's called a beta cell defect. Your beta cells aren't working right. They're the ones that make insulin. We can actually find this all out from the shape of your curve, and that then leads to strategies. And I'm a very interesting example. I'm a type 2 diabetic, I mentioned. Turns out I make insulin and my cells respond. Guess what's wrong with me? It turns out I don't release insulin from the pancreas, and there's a drug for that. So with that drug, I actually do great. My glucose is much better under control. Somebody called my hemoglobin A1C is better. My glucotype is better. So we can better manage my glucose by knowing exactly what's wrong with me. And I think that's going to be true for the future for everyone who's either type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. But we really want to start as early as possible. It's going to be a lot easier to control people's glucose if we catch them early and manage their health early. If we wait till they're already diabetic, the good case is really late stage type 2 diabetes. Those folks actually become insulin dependent because they've been out of glucose control for a long time. They've been glucose dysregulated. They actually compensate by making too much insulin, and then they wind up essentially losing that ability. It becomes a real problem.
Yeah. And now that we identify that the glucotypes are definitely playing a role and are changing the rules of the game, I would say, what do you think is coming next? What, in terms of research and in terms of clinical applications of these glucotypes, what do you think is the next step?
Yeah, I think one is what I said already, basically we call it subphenotyping, subtyping the types of diabetes, which we can get from the curve. I think building personalized nutrition programs for people like January AI is doing is huge. And it's not just nutrition, it's also behavior, meaning one of the things we discovered, if you're insulin resistant, you actually do better by exercising in the morning. And if you're insulin sensitive, you do better by exercising in the afternoon. So we can personalize that too. We can personalize people's lifestyle. So I think what we're going to have are personalized AI programs for every person, so that we can say, look, this is what's best for you. We can track you. We can better see what's going on, and therefore manage your health at a level that's never been possible. And it's all possible because of these glucose monitors and now a lot of AI. We also make sure we have physical activity integrated in these personalized programs, because that's a really, really important part of your health as well, and especially for glucose control.
Yeah, probably seeing the effect of specific approaches to exercise as well, right? So how they may impact the glucotypes.
Yeah, it turns out a brisk walk is good for you, right? As I mentioned before, right after meal. Not a slow walk's okay, but a brisk walk, believe it or not, will really suppress that spike. Other kinds of things we discovered, for example, wine will suppress glucose spikes. So at least for me, so when I drink wine, I won't spike glucose as much in the evening. Now, some people say, Mike, you should drink wine all the time. Well, I'm not ready to do that.
And what do you think is the mechanism for that one? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it has to do with your biochemistry, the way your lactose is in a different part of a biochemical pathway than glucose, and it has to do with how they're modulated. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, so there's a very, the human body is a very complicated system, right? We have a lot of checks and balances, a lot of what's called homeostasis going on. And so you really want to keep the whole thing in proper control.
Yeah, and not all individuals are created equal, for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's
I'll
true.
give you one more tip. You want to hear another tip, which is
absolutely,
you should not eat for 3 hours before bed. If you do, your glucose will stay elevated through the night. These are the kinds of things you can learn from a glucose monitor. It's pretty powerful. So, and you'll see you'll sleep better too. So these are, again, when you wear these things and you can see what's going on, it's very eye-opening.
Yeah, it is, and I think is going to become mainstream in a short period of time, for sure, because you actually listen to people like wanting to get one of those. I have heard some of my friends actually wanting to get
I think
those.
everybody should be wearing one, quite frankly.
Yeah.
They're going to be, again, if everyone who wears one, it's very eye-opening.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely of value. Let's to wrap up the conversation.
Sure.
The screening part, I think, is important. So you mentioned in your paper that many people consider themselves normal, metabolically speaking, and what you found is that some of them achieve high levels of variability, high blood sugar levels, even in the diabetic range, right? So what is the impact of that in screening for diabetes?
Yeah, well, as these devices get cheaper and cheaper, we really will be able to put them on everyone. And so it will be a way of screening that just hasn't been done before. And it will expose, aspects of glucose dysregulation that people just weren't aware of. And the nice thing is then they could, like I mentioned, that some people are spiking just as bad as diabetics and have no idea. So if you discover that, I think, again, and you can discover that early, I really think you can, modify your behavior. I'm not saying you'll prevent type 2 diabetes, but if you could push it off 5 or 10 years, I think that's a good thing. That's going to help you live a longer, healthier life.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most important message today is exactly that now you have access to a tool that allows you to monitor yourself and auto-regulate your habits and your lifestyle. And I think that's definitely super valuable. And I think that this conversation has been eye-opening, as you say. And I think my wife actually was asking me about these devices. And I think that's going to be definitely the next step, because people tend to think that these devices are only for diabetic people. And I think it's not true. I think it's probably for everybody, right?
I agree. I mean, I think people should be wearing these, and then they'll quickly learn what their glucotype is, and then they'll be able to modify their behavior. And, another few other comments, people now eat 40,000 times more sugar than they did after World War II. It's incredible how much more. And so I think when you see what's going on, when you actually wear one of these monitors and see what's going on with your glucose, it will, I hate to say it again, but it will open your eyes so that it really promotes, behavior modification. And so I think everybody should wear them. And I think we should start at an early age so we can catch glucose dysregulation early, and then get people to, lead better lifestyles. So again, they can live long, healthy lives, have nice health spans.
And it's interesting because when we were exploring the effect of diets and exercise, all the studies that are done are usually done short term. And during the time of the study, the interventions work. But the problem is long term. Adherence to exercise and diet is difficult. But these monitors may be the key to keep the motivation alive, right?
I think so. I think they're teaching tools. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Well, Dr. Snyder, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank you for your for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us, and I'm sure that our audience is going to enjoy this immensely. Thank you so much.
Sure, reach out to anyone if you have questions.
Thank you so much. And for our audience, the link to the paper and more information about the device and all the studies that Dr. Snyder and his team have conducted, you will find the links in the description. So see you in the next episode.